In 1804, the world inside of France had changed. Only a short few years ago, the Directory, the relatively restrained successor to the brutal Committee on Public Safety, had been toppled by the now First Consul of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. A new age was in the air. Stability had been restored to France. A new civil code and way of life was promulgated, and the French Senate had proclaimed the then First Consul Emperor. In the year of this definitive shift to a new era, another group of figures gathered together to imprint their mark indelibly, if possible, upon the hearts and minds of the public, by restoring what they saw as an ancient and eternal order of religion, manifested in the principles of chivalry, the practice of Freemasonry, and the equality of humanity. They would re-establish the once new knighthood spoken of by such worthies as Bernard of Clairvaux, that history knows as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, that we know as the Order of the Temple, and that everybody knows as the Knights Templar. Through the discovery, acquisition, and application of a once secret lineage and alleged continuation of this mighty order of old, they would bring forth the religion that their legend says was protected, preserved, and promulgated by it, that of the primitive Church of Christ, or what today we would call the Johannite Church. My name is Shaun McCann, and this is the Johannite Tradition, Part 3, the Primitive Church in the Modern Age. This talk is not so much a retelling of that restoration, but rather a look inside of that church and order, who they were, how they operated, and what they believed. Now, if you're joining us for the first time here, there is, as the title alludes, a first and second part of this talk. The first part focuses around the hypotheses and ideas around an early Johannite community in ancient times, the community of the beloved disciple, and how it connects to our practice of the Johannite tradition in the modern day. The second part focuses on the legends of the Knights Templar and the Johannite Church as it is manifested in different esoteric groups and including the organization we're going to talk about today. Now, many of the legends that are discussed in the second part originated in the time of the organization we're going to talk about today, that of the primitive church and the Order of the Temple, restored by a French gentleman by the name of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. So if you haven't had an opportunity to sit down with those talks, while you probably won't need them to listen to this one, it will provide additional context and continuity to some of the ideas discussed here. Before we dive into the actual meat of the talk, let's have a quick look here at some of the things we're going to cover. We are going to open up with a bit of a recap on the life of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat, who was the founder of this refoundation, and of course the circumstances around the foundation of the refounded Order of the Temple and the primitive church. We'll also take a quick peek at the backdrop or context, that being the French Revolution, Gallicanism, and the state church. After that, we're going to dive into everybody's favorite forgery legend, however you want to frame it, the L'arminius Charter. And of course, hand in hand with that goes a little bit of information about the levitikon. And the levitikon is actually several documents put into one, the main piece of which is entitled The Gospels According to the Primitive Church, which, as you probably know, and if you don't, it's worth picking up a copy. We translated and published 10 years ago. You can find links available on our main website. Now, after we've done that, we're actually going to take a quick dip into the structure of the primitive church and the Order of the Temple. I should probably have those points reversed. And The system for both of them overlaps and is quite complex, so we're not going to get quite into the nitty-gritty of all their rules and statutes and canons, else we would have a completely separate multi-hour talk. So we will get into the structure of the primitive church and the order of the temple in a section I've entitled Chivalry, Heterodoxy, and a Masonic Ecclesia, because it'll be readily apparent that there are elements of all three within it. As a part of that, we're going to take a look at the theology associated with each degree or each holy order in the primitive church. And once again, some of these are intimately linked, of course, with the order of the temple, its partner organization. After we've wrapped that portion up, we'll take a quick survey of some of the structure and elements in the Mass of the primitive church, the primary liturgy that they used as Johannite priests. And finally, we'll take a look at the question of legitimacy and the things that go into it, namely, did they have any rivals? Did they suffer any schisms? And of course, what is their legacy for the present day? Why does it matter? Or how does it come forward, as it were? Now we arrive at Section 1, Key Figures, Dates, and Elements. And while I am recording over top of the slides, so it's easy for you to follow along at home, some folks, of course, do appreciate straight audio rather than video. So also with this talk in all the places in which it's going to be posted, you will find a link to the slides so you can simply listen and follow along at your own pace. So Section 1, Key Figures, Dates, and Elements. A little bit of who we're talking about, when we're talking about, and of course what we're talking about. All right, so now we're going to get into some key dates, some key figures, and some key backdrop. Now, before we do that, I need to make two disclaimers right at the outset. Number one, my pronunciation of French and Latin and anything that basically isn't English is utterly horrendous, so I'm going to butcher this throughout, and I apologize for that if I say anything cringe-worthy in that regard. Of course, the reality is that I also butcher English, but what can we do? The second thing that it's important to note is that we're going to be covering a bunch of dates and a bunch of figures and a bunch of facts, and some of these things are actually, in fact, alleged facts, not actual facts. They are alleged to have taken place, but in some cases there's no evidence that they actually happened, right? You're dealing with the narrative, the legend, and the origin of a restoration of the primitive church, so-called, and the order of the temple, the Knights Templar. So essentially we're recounting some of the dates and the names as they claimed at the time to have happened as a part of their origin story. Now, the first one of these alleged facts, of course, begins with the first date on our list that you see on the slide, and that is 1705. We'll take a look at this a little bit deeper later when we deal with the Charter of L'arminius, but if you've listened to or watched the Johannite Tradition Part 2, you'll know that the whole thing stems from the claim or a legend that the Templars, the Order of the Temple, didn't in fact die off when it was suppressed and scattered by the King of France and the papacy in 1314, that in fact it continued to survive underground in secret by a line or lineage of secret Grand Masters from that time through to the modern era, their present day. And so the first date on the list is the alleged date when Philippe, Duke of Orleans, assumes the Grand Mastership of the Order of the Temple. And it is here in which the 1705 statutes of the Order of the Temple are written or rewritten and presented. The next date on the list is 1791, and we have to assume that there was some relative amount of peace between that time, though, of course, we're low on detail on the things that actually happened in terms of this so-called 1705 restored order and church. We're low on detail on things that happened between 1705 and 1791. But nevertheless, in 1791, during the French Revolution, when things get messy for nobles and aristocrats, when things are being seized and heads are being lopped off and whatnot, during a time of great danger, during the French Revolution, one thing in particular happens, or rather two accounts of one particular event. And that is the artifacts or the main documents, lineage documentation, statutes, and rituals get transferred from the Grand Master of the day, which is the Duke of Brissac, to a gentleman by the name of Claude Mathieu Radix de Chevillon. And that Chevillon becomes the regent of the order. Now, there's conflicting accounts here. Some say that this was, transferred, and that Chevillon had this stuff given to him, and that he was named the regent of the order. The other accounts have it essentially that the revolutionary activity functionally re-smashed the Order of the Temple into inactivity, and that these rituals, this documentation of lineage and the authoritative documents in order to run the order were purchased or discovered by a gentleman by the name of Jacques-Philippe Ledru, who was a co-worker, as it were, in Freemasonry of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. So essentially that there's two accounts, and they arrive at the same point, that Radix de Chevillon becomes the regent of the order and receives the material necessary to run the order and the documentation of the order. And so this is either given to him directly, or it is purchased or discovered in the Duke's artifacts by Jacques-Philippe Ledru. And so Chevillon functions as the regent of the order until such a time that it's safe to convene a general council of the order to elect a new Grand Master. And we know who gets elected the next Grand Master, of course, but we'll get to that in time. The next date that we have on our list has some question marks around it, but nonetheless, I've chosen to include it because it was an important part of the narrative by their own account. And this is the fact that, or the alleged fact that Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat was consecrated as a Johannite bishop by a Johannite bishop. By the name of Arnal, who served as the Cure de Pontoise, affectionately known as or nicknamed the Templar. How's that for an impressive title? And this isn't necessarily documented in any lineage or anything else like that. The reason why this is notable, or the reason why we're taking this at face value, both for its actual occurrence and its importance, is the fact that this is attested to in fabre-palaprat's own words in a letter to l'ami de la religion in 1834. So Palaprat writes that he was in fact consecrated a Johannite bishop by somebody who was specifically a Johannite bishop, as opposed to a bishop who was breaking away from another church. In 1804, Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat is elected Grand Master and Sovereign Pontiff of the Order of the Temple. Now, this restored Order of the Temple. And everybody generally associates, for shorthand or for ease, this restoration of the Order of the Temple and functionally the primitive church as having happened in 1804. But from their perspective, and I can't speak to this with surety, but I do believe that I've more or less got the right of it, that effectively what fabre-palaprat is restoring or reactivating isn't the medieval Templars and Johannite Church as such. What fabre-palaprat is in fact restoring is this 1705 Order of the Temple that I alluded to earlier. That this is getting this restarting of the Order of the Temple is again being restarted in 1804. The other thing, I mentioned he becomes Grand Master and Sovereign Pontiff of the Order of the Temple. That's because in the legend, you have Johannite bishops, ancient Johannite bishops and medieval Johannite bishops functionally transmitting their authority to the Grand Masters of the Temple. And the Grand Masters of the Temple, through persecution, transmitted all in secret up to the then present day, so that the office of Grand Master and Sovereign Pontiff of the Johannite Church are effectively rolled into one office. But in 1804, the thing that he's rebooting is the Order of the Temple. The Johannite Church, as such, doesn't have a public existence at that time. It's just kind of all rolled into one. There are ecclesiastical offices within the Order of the Temple at that time, but there isn't a Johannite church or a primitive church as such. The other thing that's important to note is I'm using some of these terms interchangeably. We all generally refer to this as the Johannite church or the Église Johannites, the Johannite Church of primitive Christians, but they referred to themselves as the primitive church, the primitive Christian church, or the primitive Catholic church. So I'm using primitive church and Johannite church interchangeably. The reality is they referred to themselves as the primitive church, and in some cases simply as the Église du Christ, or the Church of Christ. So 1804, fabre-palaprat becomes Grand Master and Sovereign Pontiff of the Order of the Temple. In 1810 now we have a documented second, or perhaps first, depending on whether you view the first as being reality or not. But in 1810 you have the consecration of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat by Mauviel, who's the constitutional bishop of Haiti, and who was himself consecrated by Jean-Baptiste Royer and Abbé Grégoire, both of them bishops of the Constitutional Church. And in fact, Abbé Grégoire, or Henri Grégoire, was the first to take the civil oath of the Constitutional Church. Now, I'll get into this a little bit later, but the reason why the Constitutional Church is significant ties into the overall ideology or kind of motivation of the church in order to a certain degree. During the French Revolution, the government established something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And effectively what this did is it put the Roman Catholic Church in France under state control. So it kind of subordinated the church to the state. In theory, you could describe this actually as a whole separate church with its own separate structure. But functionally, the state took over the Roman Catholic Church in France, and they required they not only elected priests and bishops, they required them to take an oath to the state. Some of this was for nationalistic means, for identity, the idea of a state church. Some of this was simply because during the revolution the government went broke. As I understand it, my history of the revolution is actually not the best, so I'm sure I'm going to flub some of this. But during the revolution, they needed some cash. Who's got the cash? The church has the cash. Now, of course, you see this played out centuries earlier in the lifetime of the original or actual Order of the Temple, where the state is making a grab for church cash by way of the Knights Templar. So you have a little bit of the same type of things that are playing out here. So it's significant that Palaprat is consecrated effectively by breakaway or state bishops. 1812/1831, we have the discovery/presentation of the levitikon, and in truth there are so many conflicting stories out there about these dates. This is where things start to get a little bit fuzzy, because I've seen the dates presented as 1804, I've seen them presented as 1812, 1814, and 1831, that the levitikon comes around. It's also worth noting that the levitikon isn't one document as such. It's actually a collection of documents, ecclesiastical rituals, catechisms. The centerpiece of the levitikon is what's called the Gospels of the Primitive Church, which, if you've been hanging out with us for a while, you know that the AJC translated the Gospels according to the Primitive Church, and we published it in 2010. And you can find more information on that and a link to it off the website. So, and of course, there are different stories about where the levitikon came from. That it was discovered, that it was purchased in a book stall, those kind of things. Either way, essentially they came across this text I've settled on using the date of 1812. This is where, and it's these documents essentially where the Johannite faith comes from. Now, in the levitikon, of course, there is commentary and rituals and catechisms that they themselves wrote. So that's not, when I say the discovery of the levitikon, they didn't discover that stuff, they wrote it effectively as a commentary on the Gospels of the primitive church, which is the thing that they claim to have discovered in 1812/1814. Now, I've divided here between the discovery and the presentation because from everything I can tell, the levitikon, in other words, the commentary and the rituals and the secret Gospels themselves, the Gospels according to the primitive church, were functionally an internal document at that time. This was something that wasn't publicly available. This is something that they used internally for their own membership. In 1831, the levitikon is published as a combination document. So you have those commentaries, you have those rituals, you have those statutes, and of course you have the Gospels. And the Gospels, according to the primitive church, again, claims to be a more authentic or a more original version of the Gospel of John. And we'll get into a little bit of what they mean by that later on. So listed again here, we have the date of 1812 as the effective founding of the primitive church. That the religious, there's already some religious activity bundled into the Order of the Temple. After all, the Knights Templar weren't just a military order, they were a religious and military order. They took vows. So there's some implicit religious and spiritual activity in there as they refounded this, either in 1705 or in 1804. But the discovery of the Gospels that would be published with the levitikon is what really essentially gives the spiritual injection into it, so much so that they form a church around it, which is paired up with, which is the primitive church, and it's paired up with the Order of the Temple. Now, the last date we have in there, of course, is 1838, which is the death of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat, which is going to have a whole host of effects, mostly negative on the functioning of the Order of the Temple and the primitive church. And we're going to explore a little bit about what happens after Palaprat dies, the legacy and the schisms and whatnot, when we get to the last section of this talk. Okay, let's take a bit of a quick lightning round run through some biographical details around our central figure here, the Sovereign Pontiff and Patriarch and Grandmaster himself, Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. If you're interested in more detail on him as well as on the levitikon, we have lectures on our channel and podcasts that cover just that. But for now, I'm using those to kind of give some quick detail here, so I've shamelessly taken from those other talks. In 1773, Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat is born in Cordes, France, in the department of Tarn and canton of Albi. And if the folks at home are paying attention, that is, of course, Albi as in the Cathars, Albigensian heresy, as it were. The Palaprat family was a respected clan of poets and lawyers and doctors who had for many years served as municipal councillors of Toulouse. And he does have some famous blood in his family, that of Jean Palaprat, who was a famous lawyer and playwright. So in 1786, he began studies at Diocesan Seminary, only a few short years before, of course, 1789, the start of the French Revolution. And roughly at about the halfway point of the French Revolution in 1793, he was ordained a priest. Now, obviously, this is a man with some drive and some energy, because he didn't simply stop at being ordained a priest. He chose to enroll in medical school, which he did in 1794. And indeed, it's his medical work for which he would make his name out in secular and civil society. And I think it's important that we take a pause here to discuss that briefly, because I think it tells you a little bit about the character of the man, particularly because he's the nexus point around which this controversy, from the controversy around the Charter of Larminius to the controversy around the primitive Gospels. He's the nexus point around which all this swirls. That, and also he made some pretty substantial claims about the nature of the primitive church, and of course about the restored order of the temple. So, normally you have people who start these new religious movements, and sometimes, we all know, we've seen enough documentaries to know that there are a lot of founders and figures that come off, frankly, as quacks. This is a guy in the medical and secular realm of his day was considered anything but a quack. If anything, he had a high degree of education, a high degree of service, and by all accounts, a high degree of integrity. Some of the distinctions for which he would be awarded throughout almost 40 years of his career. He was a Knight of the Legion of Honor, which was awarded for medical services to the wounded, I believe during the Battle of Paris. Of course, he was a doctor of medicine. We've already mentioned that. He was a priest. He was also the president of the Athenaeum of Arts in Paris, president of the Royal Society of Sciences, president of the Royal Antiquarian Society of France, and president of the Galvanic Society of France. Now, Galvanism was something that he went into later, and essentially at that time, Galvanism was the study of the use of electricity in medicine. He was also given by the city of Paris its gold medal, the Médaille d'Or, however you pronounce it. So he obviously made a significant name for himself with a great deal of education and a great deal of service, and by all accounts, from peers and leaders of the day, a man with significant integrity. So he graduated in 1798 from medical school as a surgeon. And in 1798 and 1799, he set up a medical practice in Paris. Another significant thing to know, now that we're past the main set of dates, both in Palaprat's life and in the precursor movement and activity prior to the refounding of the Order of the Temple, an important thing to know was the fact that Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat was a member of the Chevalier de la Croix. And this was kind of this was a Masonic lodge, but it was made up essentially of the upper crust of Freemasonry at the time. And this is where he would meet a lot of his co-workers and co-conspirators, for lack of a better term, in the order. That he met the folks that he would collaborate with on the Order of the Temple in the Chevalier de la Croix, the Knights of the Cross, the Lodge of the Knights of the Cross. So, as we mentioned, going back to the initial set of key dates, there was functionally a gap in activity from 1791, 1792 to 1804. And during this period of time, the regency for the order, for the claimed 1705 order, was held by Claude Mathieu Radix de Chevillon. And it was in 1804 that a convent general would be held by the order to elect its new Grand Master. And this Grand Master, Sovereign Pontiff and Patriarch, of course, was Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. So the order, the 1705 order in our narrative, if we take their own narrative at face value, the order was functionally refounded in 1804. It was reactivated after a period of dormancy / regency by Radix de Chevillon. So it was functionally refounded in 1804, and then later on the church would be functionally refounded in 1812. Now, I love the study of history. I am an amateur at best, but it is something that I have always enjoyed throughout my life, and I hope to enjoy for many years to come. And one of the things I've found in my amateur survey of history is that context is king. There is no such thing as an isolated event. Everything comes for or has its roots in other events, either contemporary or previous to that time. Everything is influenced by everything else. And a huge influence on the foundation, refoundation of the Order of the Temple and the primitive church in time, of course, was the French Revolution. And hand in hand with that is the old seed of what is called Gallicanism. So, as I alluded to earlier, as a part of the French Revolution, the government essentially took over the church, or commandeered the church, as it were. In some parts for power, in some parts for cash, and, underlining it all a little bit of a national agenda, a little bit of a nationalist agenda. So you have this thing called the Civil Constitution of the clergy, to which the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church were subordinated to the state. And each of them was required to take an oath to the state, and it was the state that determined who would be priests and who would be bishops. So one of the first people to take the oath of the civil constitution of the clergy was Henri Gregoire, the Abbé Gregoire. And Abbé Gregoire would be responsible for consecrating the man that would consecrate fabre-palaprat. So this is a social, political stew from which all this gets born and put into place, with a lot of hands on heads and influence going from person to person, in my opinion. I mean, some of the folks involved and connected to, either in the immediate of the Order of the Temple and the Primitive Church, or connected to by one degree, were prominent figures of the state church and its movement. Hand in hand with this, and tying into this, of course, is something that's called Gallicanism, which was essentially named, of course, for the old name for France being Gaul, right? Now, Gallicanism basically, when you treat anytime you treat anything briefly, you cut off the corners to a certain degree. So I am playing fast and loose with detail here because we've got a lot of talk to go. But the essential point behind Gallicanism is the idea that the state should have comparable power to the Pope, including over the church in their own domain. And this is an old idea that would rear its head over the course of several centuries throughout France. So this wasn't something new, even though the Revolution was new and obviously a significant turning point in history, not just for France, but indeed for the world, because it would go on to inspire so many other movements. But the idea of Gallicanism actually goes way back into the DNA of the nation of France. In fact, it originated in the time of Boniface VIII, which, you guessed it, of course, is the latter years of the original Order of the Temple. So this is something, of course, that this pendulum swing, this push and pull, this give and take between state and church is something that is old news, essentially, in France. And the Revolution is another place in which this pops out of, new circumstance, old dilemma. And of course, the pendulum of church versus state was a wider issue that had built across Europe. I mean, this is something, you have in the High Middle Ages, essentially, you have the height of the church's power and reach under the papacy of Innocent III, which was also the time when a lot of other great movements, such as the Mendicant orders and religious orders, would come into play. But this push and pull between church and state had been going on for centuries, and not just in France, but across the entire of Europe. One of the most historically notable events in that time comes with the so-called Holy Roman Empire, which I think, as Mar Thomas likes to note from time to time, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was functionally German, but this is the investiture controversy between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII, which ultimately involved Henry IV waiting out in the snow for several days to grovel and apologize to the Pope. The dispute was over who had the right to invest bishops, hence the name, the investiture controversy. So now fast forward back, of course, to the time of Palaprat, which more properly would be called not only the Revolutionary era, but the Napoleonic era. The civil constitution of the clergy, as it was manifest and put into practice, was functionally a veto on church power. They took over the cash, the land, the oaths, the whole 9 yards of the Roman Catholic Church, and it gave essentially the state a significant hand in every church action, and church decrees, of course, were subject to both veto and enforcement by the state. Now, as I've noted earlier, there were numerous proponents of Gallican ideas, Gallicanism, the civil constitution of the clergy and the state church, associated with the Templar and Johannite revival. Particularly, as I mentioned, Mauviel, who consecrated Palaprat, and Mauviel's consecrators, Jean-Baptiste Royer and the Abbé Henri Gregoire. Given this influence in the circle around Palaprat, around having a church that is French in nature for the people of France and distancing itself physically and morally and authoritatively from the power of Rome, of course it should come no surprise that some of the legends and the narratives that you find in the Order of the Temple, particularly in the main medieval style legend around the Order of the Temple and the primitive church, that you should discover an anti-Rome sentiment, which of course we find present in the actual institutional narrative, as we call it these days, the central myth of the Order of the Temple and the primitive church, where it notes essentially that the Templars took their oaths between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople, a see always openly hostile to Rome since the time of Photius. So this anti-Roman idea is not only baked into the founders' circle, as it were, for the primitive church and the Order of the Temple, it's further baked into the legend. This is something where, this is us, this is ours, and we stand independent of Rome. And this is a claim that Palaprat will reinforce and underline throughout his time as a leader of this movement. Lastly, you'll see my point again about the Abbé Gregoire, who was the first to take the state church oath. So obviously a significant figure within that movement, and he would directly influence the people, who would directly influence the people, as it were. An additional point to consider that I actually didn't include in my notes or my slides is not just the fact that the circle around the founders of the Order of the Temple and the primitive church, not only that they were involved with the state church and had state church support and also supported the idea of the state or national French church, that not only was that there kind of at the outset or founding, the influence of the founding of the Order of the Temple and the primitive church, that in fact the primitive church and the Order of the Temple also had official support from on high during its actual operation since that time, most notably from Napoleon himself, who attended a significant religious event for the Order of the Temple. And indeed, initiates and members of the Order of the Temple and the primitive church were allowed to wear their medals for the order during civil and secular events, showing that the state had actually recognized the validity of the order itself, essentially. We've spent roughly 36 minutes and that's on this talk, and that's only context to give you an idea of the social, political, and religious context, and of course on the central figures involved and their own contexts in histories. So we still haven't even got to the main bulk of the talk yet, and indeed this section and the section after it are more context. However, that said, this is where things begin to get a lot more interesting, because this is where things begin to get a lot more controversial. And there is probably the most, one of the most, if not the most controversial thing historically within this entire talk, of course, is the Larminius Charter, the authority on which this whole affair is based. Now, it is referred to in Latin as the Carta Transmissionis, and the fact that I mess up the Latin also has a significance here, because it's messed up Latin
that gives scholars reason to believe that the Larminius Charter is a forgery. So the Larminius Charter is essentially the account of the secret lineage in which the Knights Templar survived from medieval times until the contemporary age. And so it is claimed of it, and within its own narrative history, that it originated in 1324 when the Grand Mastership of the Knights of the Temple had already been in the control of a Jean-Marc Larminius of Palestine. So essentially this was written 10 years after authority was secretly transferred to him, and he was now documenting it in preparation to pass it on himself, because by all accounts of the narrative, he was not a young man. So the Larminius Charter, or Charter of Transmission, is claimed to have a 1324 origination, and it's first presented to the public, of course, in 1804, when the Order of the Temple is effectively refounded through the election of Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. Now, supposedly, and I don't have a source for this, so I'm going second and third hand here because it's essentially stories all the way down. But supposedly the Larminius Charter was shown privately during the 1705 restoration. So essentially, and this dovetails into my belief, which I will explore a little bit later, that fabre-palaprat in fact did not make all this stuff up. He actually, by all accounts of his integrity in civil society, in the world of medicine, and as a priest, that he wasn't the type to perpetuate to knowingly perpetuate an outright lie. That said, there is significant, if not overwhelming, evidence to suggest that the Larminius Charter, frankly, is fake, right? So the idea, my take on it, my personal take on it, is that Palaprat, likely, knowing all that I know about him, would not have knowingly perpetuated a fraud. So he received this thing essentially in good faith, and he transmitted in good faith. That said, that given that the likelihood that the Charter of Transmission is a forgery, then I would believe that if it was forged or faked, it was done in the previous generation of said Order of the Temple, particularly the 1705 era. Now, there's a rabbit hole that I could go down there to explain why that would have been advantageous, why that kind of forgery would have been advantageous in the 1705 era, but really that's a whole other talk. So the Larminius Charter is claimed to originate in 1324. It's presented to the public in 1804 with the Grand Mastership of fabre-palaprat, and supposedly it's privately shown in 1705. Whether or not it originated in Palaprat's time or whether or not it originated a century before, we do not know. If my own personal take is that Palaprat did not forge it. The possibility here is that either somebody in his circle forged it and passed it on to him, or it was handed down from a previous generation. But essentially, he received it in good faith. That's my take. We'll get into that in a slide later. But so the Charter of Transmission is essentially an account of the transmission of the Grand Mastership in 1314 to Jean-Marc Larminius, and it details the succession to the then present day, with of course the figures I've mentioned already listed at the end. So, for example, Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, Claude Mathieu Radix de Chevillon as regent, and then Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat. This document, this account of the lineage, this account of the transmission of authority, because you can't really transmit a lineage as much, at least in the sense that we're talking about with apostolic succession, through a piece of paper, right? However, authority can be transmitted by paper, and this is what essentially the Larminius Charter purports to represent, that transmission. So this is the basis of the restoration of the Order of the Temple. And as I've noted several times before in the talk, the order that they were properly restoring based on their own accounts was that of the 1705 Order of the Duke of Orleans, the Restored Order of the Temple, and its statutes. Now, I mentioned that Latin, of course, was a problem for the, well, it's not only a problem for me, it's a problem for the charter. And the Charter of Transmission, the Larminius Charter, is widely seen as a forgery. And this is the reason why. The Latin at the time in the Charter is not the Church Latin of Templar times, which obviously the Templars had some chops, they had some power, they had some education, they had some reach, and they had some money. However, not all of them were educated. The elite of the Templars were, but certainly there were illiterate members among its ranks. And even then, essentially the difference in Latin between the High Middle Ages and, of course, the Latin that you find in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is largely reserved for, you guessed it, medicine, are vastly different. So the Latin in the Larminius Charter is essentially Latin that is contemporary to the 18th century. Now, which would lead one to believe naturally that it's a forgery. It was written in the 18th century. Now, the people who counter this counter it on the basis that they believe that as the charter was copied and signed, or essentially transmitted, because the likelihood of a document staying intact for a few hundred years is pretty slim, that essentially that this charter was copied out and rewritten over time, and each Grand Master appending their name to the list, and that over time, as this was copied out and passed along, that the scribes involved corrected the Latin. It's a little bit convenient of an explanation, but that's their view. That said, it is widely believed to be a forgery. There are a couple points in favor of palaprat that I think counter some of that narrative, but in my opinion, that doesn't actually speak to the validity of the charter. It just speaks to the fact that I think palaprat wouldn't knowingly perpetuate a fraud. Now, this, in terms of the Charter of Larminius, this Larminius lineage, the lineage of secret Grand Masters of the Templars, this essentially is the basis of pretty much every modern or so-called Neo-Templar order that you find today. And there are probably 50 to 100 of them, and I think I'm lowballing that number. So you have the SMOTJ, you have the OSMTH, the OSMOTJ, OSTI. There are a handful of Neo-Templar orders with a lot of similar names. Most of them translate to the Order of the Knights of the Temple of Jerusalem or Order of the Temple, that kind of thing. Some of their names are in Latin, some of their names are in French, some of their names are in English. But there are probably 50 to 100 Neo-Templar orders around in the world, most of them schisms or breaks off of other orders into infinitesimally small groups, or groups that functionally only exist on the internet. But the small groups and the big successful groups alike, most of them trace their origin to this refounding by Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat, and particularly, whether they acknowledge it or not, particularly to the Charter of Larminius. And there's lots of orders that say, hey, we don't buy the story, we just trace back to this person who restarted this noble cause. We think the charter is fake, however, we think his work was real, and thus we connect ourselves to it historically, lineally, spiritually, and ideologically. So a lot of these things go back to the Charter of Larminius. The second in our series of controversial documents would be the Levitikon, which is itself, of course, a series of documents of its own. And the Levitikon, of course, has multiple parts, but the essential detail is that the Levitikon appears to have been presented internally to the Order of the Temple in 1812, particularly with the refounding of the primitive church. This is where the religious aspects within this tradition really come to the fore with the foundation of its own ecclesia. So it's presented internally to the members in and around 1812, and it's published, as I mentioned earlier, in 1831. Now, the Levitikon, as mentioned, is not one document. It is actually several documents. It is essentially a compendium or encyclopedia of things Johannite in this particular era. So it's divided into several sections. It has the statutes, essentially the canon law of the primitive church. It has the Gospels according to the primitive church, which is essentially the most important part of it, because this claims to be the original Gospel of John. It also has the catechism and the ceremonial of the degrees. Now, essentially, the catechism is the teachings that they build up and build out in question and answer format from the things that are either directly stated or implied in the primitive Gospels. They're basing that on a combination of their own oral traditions, such as it was after the Order of the Temple having been around for almost a decade at that point, and the teachings found within the Gospels according to the primitive church. There's also in the book a documentation of the Larminius lineage, going back, of course, from fabre-palaprat back to Jean-Marc Larminius, but they take it even further. They go all the way back, like a traditional line of apostolic succession or episcopal lineage. They go all the way back to the time of Christ. So the lineage of John, as it were, is listed out from Christ all the way to fabre-palaprat, complete with dates and everything. Legit? Well, who knows, right? But this is also when you deal with the nature of apostolic succession, which is arguably the oldest, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, kind of Western spiritual lineage. Things are going to get fuzzy the further back you go. Indeed, the Roman Catholic Church can really only definitively date their own lineage back to the 14th or 15th century, and 91% or 92%, I believe it's 91% of Roman Catholic bishops, of which there's 5,000 or 6,000, all trace back to one guy whose own ordination doesn't have a definitive record of. So you're dealing with some pretty dicey stuff here. So you can only imagine when you go back a further 1,500 years how dicey that's going to be. It may not have been the apostles, it may have been the apostles' neighbor Bob. That said, it does, because ordinations and communities are, except in times of persecution, are fundamentally public things. It represents a historical continuity, essentially. We know the lineage exists because the church has existed throughout that time. Now, when it comes to this lineage here, however, you can't necessarily make that assumption, and the whole idea of a medieval Johannite church is essentially one that's found in a legend perpetuated by the primitive church in the 19th century. So, for what it's worth, you have a documentation of this lineage, and then, of course, finally, you have commentary on the whole affair, from commentary on Revelation to commentary on the statutes, and commentary on the primitive Gospels, and of course, the fundamental commentary that is the catechisms themselves. An important thing to note about the focus of the Levitikon throughout is that everything is dated and documented with a lunar calendar, and they date their year from the foundation of the Order of the Temple. So, like all good new regimes or folks that imagine themselves to be a regime, they decide to give themselves a new calendar for the sake of legitimacy, basing essentially their founding along those lines. So it's a lunar calendar with a Levitical, that is to say, priestly focus. Levitical being a reference to the Levites, the priestly tribe of the Old Testament. And the idea throughout this document and series of documents is that the priesthood they're restoring in this primitive church is not a new order of priesthood, but essentially the restoration of an eternal order, one that they trace back to, obviously, the foggy mists of antiquity, essentially the classical world, right? And further back to the Old Testament. And just like every good Orientalist, esoteric-ish society of the 19th century back to Egypt, because around this time everything goes back to Egypt. And of course Egypt was a big deal at this time. Why? Because Napoleon went to Egypt, and you have the Rosetta Stone, so it opens up this whole fascinating realm of history that we only had so much knowledge on at that point, but that was about to be blown wide open. So historically and secularly, Egypt was a pretty big deal at that time. And of course, as with lots of esoteric movements, subversive or otherwise, everybody likes to claim an older foundation for their tradition and their authority, spiritual, religious, political, whatever it is. And the going thing for that day, and the going thing even for secret societies in today, everybody likes to trace back to Egypt, and fabre-palaprat and his crew were no different. Now that we've spent a little bit of time looking at the collection of documents and texts that are the levitikon, I think it's important we take a few moments to pause and zoom in on the Gospels according to the primitive church. One of the reasons why the Gospels according to the primitive church is important to this whole affair is that effectively it's the foundation, it's the bedrock, the origin story of the origin story. So the Charter of Larminius essentially recounts a lineage of secret Templar Grand Masters that comes up to the then present day of fabre-palaprat. But as the Levitikon points out, this lineage in fact extends well before the Knights Templar and goes back to the time of Christ. And so this alleged pure version or original version of the Gospel of John shows effectively in a few lines the origin point of this lineage, by stating essentially that Christ appointed John the Apostle, the beloved disciple, as his successor. So this now Johannite lineage passes up through medieval times from a supposed medieval Johannite church in Asia Minor to the Knights Templar, and the Knights Templar pass it in secret through to the present day. So the role functionally that the Gospels according to the primitive church plays for the primitive church is akin to the role and relationship that the Charter of Larminius has with its partner organization, the Order of the Temple. So what are the Gospels according to the primitive church? The reason why they're called the Gospels according to the primitive church is that every chapter in this Gospel is effectively labeled as its own Gospel. So instead of saying chapter 1, you've got the first Gospel and the second Gospel and the third Gospel. So the Gospels according to the primitive church has been claimed to be an alleged pure version of the Gospel of John, an original version of the Gospel of John. This really isn't that controversial of an idea. There are all sorts of, we're Gnostics, right? So everybody here has either an intimate or a passing familiarity with the texts of the Nag Hammadi Codex, which of course contains innumerable Gospels attributed to a variety of figures. So the idea that there are other Gospels floating out there that didn't make it into the biblical canon over the course of Christian history is not a crazy idea, essentially. Another idea that isn't crazy as such, and we know this from history, is essentially that there are more than one version of a gospel or scriptural text. Examples of this, of course, would be the secret book of John in the Nag Hammadi, and in the canonical Bible we have the Gospel of Mark that in fact has different versions or different endings, as it were. So the Gospels according to the primitive church are essentially claiming to be a original or pure or unedited, uncorrupted version of the Gospel of John. Now around it they give a little bit of a pedigree or a timeline, I guess as you were. They frame it in a particular context, or if they didn't, at least folks around them did. And so essentially what they're saying is that the Gospels according to the primitive church, essentially as they have it, it is a 12th century copy attributed to a Nicephorus of Athens, which was in turn made from a 5th century manuscript. Now this part itself is curious, because if you're going to fake something or have a lie about something, as we know from other esoteric societies and new religious movements, there's a lot of folks who lack modesty in this regard, and they tend to go whole hog. Something has descended from heaven, something has been unearthed from the depths, and what have you. We have this directly from the mouth of Jesus. We have this directly from the hand of the apostle. Those kind of things. They're not actually going that whole hog. They're saying that what they have is a 12th century copy of a 5th century manuscript. So they're not actually taking the Gospels according to the primitive church, this alleged pure version of the Gospel of John, and they're not actually putting it in apostolic times. They're saying this goes back to the 5th century. So it's actually, as possible fakeries go, it's actually somewhat restrained. Now, there are a couple of things, of course, that are significant about the Gospels of the primitive church, and the AJC has dedicated some significant time to comparing this document or these Gospels side by side with the Gospel of John as we know it in the canonical Bible. So I'm not going to explore all of that here. We do have a series of parts from a talk in which the primitive Gospels are compared side by side with the Gospel of John, verse by verse. So if you haven't had a chance to explore that, or if this is a topic that is interesting to you, then I highly recommend you spend some time with it. So here I'm only going to summarize a couple points, and these points essentially are worked up or fleshed out by the primitive church in their catechism. The significant parts being that the Gospels according to the primitive church hint that Christ is learned in the mystery and science of Greece and Egypt. They imply that he's had some time and some learning and possibly initiation in Greece and Egypt. They also state explicitly that John the Apostle is the successor of Christ. And as we know, this is the line that essentially becomes the origin story of the origin story where the Charter of L'arminius is concerned. So they're taking this lineage, they're going through the Middle Ages, and they're going all the way back to the time of Christ on the basis of this one particular line. And lastly, significantly, as opposed to the canonical Gospel of John, there is no resurrection narrative present in the primitive Gospels. So we've spent the last little while kind of zoomed in to look at both the Charter of L'arminius and, of course, this supposed original version of the Gospel of John. Now I want to zoom out a little bit and take a look at the actual whence cometh of the situation. What is the possibility that we're dealing with? And for here, I'm going to take some points that Monsignor Jordan Stratford articulated in his introduction to the Gospels according to the primitive church. Now, these points primarily apply and are directed at the Gospels according to the primitive church, but you can apply many of them also to the situation with the Charter of L'arminius. So taking a look at some of these points or some of these possibilities as to where these Gospels come from, Jordan has broken it down into 5 central possibilities. Number 1, the entire enterprise was a fraud perpetuated by fabre-palaprat. The document was a forgery concocted to provide his occult society with authority. Number 2, the document is a modern forgery, and Palaprat unwittingly fell for what amounts to a practical joke. Now, he notes, one wonders what the motive would be, however. We do see a number of Enlightenment-era attempts to euhemerize the Bible through aggressive redaction, but those tend to omit any miraculous events, whereas in the Gospels according to the primitive church, it includes the miracles of the loaves and fishes, of water into wine, and the raising of Lazarus. Number 3, the possibility that the Gospels are an authentic medieval document, but that its authorship was spontaneous, which is to say that someone originated this version out of nothing in the 12th century. 4th possibility is that the document is authentic, and it genuinely speaks to an existing tradition or legends concerning the Gospels, but was only written down when this text was penned. And the last possibility here that Jordan looks at is that the document is an accurate copy of a much older text and is in effect an alternate accounting of the Gospel of John before later and more familiar redactions. So the primitive church / order of the temple / Bernard-Raymond fabre-palaprat has effectively presented the world with two controversies. One, the Charter of L'arminius, and two, the primitive Gospels. And so these 5 points are what I think are an accurate summation of what the possibilities are for how these things really, in fact, came about. So as we have seen, Palaprat and his circle bring forth two things of note and controversy. Number one, a secret lineage, and number two, the claim of an original gospel which shows the origin or authority of that lineage, as it were. Those are both very significant. They're significant claims in any time, and they were certainly going to be significant claims in his time. So I think it's important we take a quick couple-minute look here and say, how did they actually view it at the time? They came out with this lineage and this Gospel of John. How did people in Palaprat's own day look at it? Of course, this isn't a complete analysis, and this is something that some folks in the AJC continue to research on their own. So I don't want to jump the gun ahead of some folks and spoil the basis of possible future presentations, though I do look forward to them making them at the time. But I do think it is important to say, now that we've talked about all this stuff and all of this backdrop in their documents, how was this effort actually seen at the time, particularly around the lineage and the basis for the lineage, which is this primitive version or original version of the Gospel of John? The best that I can tell at the time, being right now, of course, is that there were no contemporary sources that claimed this was a forgery. Nobody in Palaprat's day said this was fake, and nobody accused Palaprat and his circle of faking it. And given the political climate at the time, given the general infighting that you have in esoteric societies, which was also true of Freemasonry and whatnot in its day, that if somebody wanted to attack fabre-palaprat, somebody wanted to attack the Order of the Temple or the primitive church, this, simply put, would be the easiest way to do it. And nobody did it. And now, the version we have of the Gospels according to the primitive church comes to us in French. And as you know, the AJC put out a translated version from the French to the English. But the Gospel, it is claimed, originated in Greek. It's a 12th century copy, essentially 12th century Latin copy of a 5th century Greek manuscript, supposedly, right? So there is the idea, or there is this claim, that there either is or there was at some point a Greek original version of this supposed original Gospel of John. So we've got the French text, we do not have the Greek text. So while the manuscript or the copy of it resists a surviving copy in the present day, text circulated at the time in scholarly circles was in fact Greek. So by best we can tell, there appeared to be a Greek version that did in fact circulate at that time. The other thing is that scholars, at least in that particular day with the knowledge that they had, some of them have attested to the primitive Gospels as actually being legit. In other words, not originated in Palaprat's time, but actually originating in medieval times. But they discuss it in the context that they believe it to be essentially a medieval edit of the Gospel of John that originated with Bogomil Christians. So we've now reached the end, effectively, of part one. To give a little bit of the background, the central timeline and events, central figures, and of course, central controversies, all of which sets the stage for an exploration of the actual organizations themselves. So in part two, we're going to cover the structure, the degrees, and the belief found in the primitive church and the Order of the Temple. And I want to thank you for joining me thus far, and I hope that you will come dig into that exploration with me next time. So I'll catch you then. Thank you.